Everyone, thank you for being here. This is the first of our webinar series for OCD Midwest titled You Are Here, Your Guide to Beginning Your Journey with OCD. This is today's webinar. It's going to be October 10th, 2022, which is the second day of OCD Awareness Week 2022. We are OCD Midwest, the International OCD Foundation's affiliate for the Midwest region covering Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. We are a group of members of clinicians and lived experienced individuals that deal with OCD and try to represent a population of people with OCD and their families with educational content and awareness. Today's webinar is going to be a series of question and answers. We've got some pre-decided questions that are going to be asked, and then we're going to be discussing those questions. Just as a quick disclaimer, this webinar and webinar series does not replace any official treatment or any kind of professional help. If you have any difficulties finding a provider, please go to www.iocdf.org, which is the International OCD Foundation. And they do have a resource list there of providers by state. And with that being said, I'm Mike Sizemore. I'm a board member with OCD Midwest. I'm also a certified peer support specialist in the state of Ohio, and I have lived experience with OCD. Jon Bommarito is also a certified peer support specialist in the state of Ohio, who also has lived experience with OCD. And Joanna Hardis is a licensed independent social worker specializing in the treatment of anxiety disorders and OCD using CBT in the Cleveland, Ohio area. And with that being said, if anybody has any questions, I'll go ahead and start with our first question that was submitted.
Thank you for that introduction, Mike. That was great. So I think probably the question that had the most weight behind it, if I can start it off with you guys, was what do you guys wish you knew then that you know now? So seeing as both of you guys have a lot of lived experience and a lot of recovery behind you, what do you wish that you knew at the beginning of your recovery that you know now that might help folks that are newly diagnosed? Any takers?
I'll go.
Thanks, Jon.
For me, I was diagnosed in 2017, so it's been going on 5 years now. Shocking. It's fun how time flies. So yeah, I would say like when you're first starting out that there's never too much therapy. Like when I first started out, I should have probably been inpatient, but I was going twice a week when I was really going through OCD battles, and like just having that help, because finding that support and help from a therapist, just be able to identify what is going on with me, and once you actually learn like, oh, I have this thing, like it's an uphill battle, but at least you have that idea that like I know what's going on with me. I'm not just crazy in my head, or there's something like permanently flawed with me. It's just this thing that we need to, it's just a different type of thing. Like someone gets cancer, like you just have, this is your battle to fight. So that was my number one thing. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I got diagnosed pretty early on in my life. I was diagnosed when I was 13 years old, and I'm this coming April I'll be 39, and so OCD hit me like a ton of bricks. It almost seemed like. I mean, now like a lot of people, I can look back in my history and see that it was actually probably there before I even realized it was there, and I guess just some things that I would take away and say that I wish I knew that I've learned since then were things like, just because your mind is racing, and just giving you a lot of irrational thoughts, and doesn't mean that you're crazy, doesn't mean that, there's something wrong, that you're broken, doesn't mean that, you can't participate with the rest of society doesn't mean that you're somehow less than of a person. It just means that, you know, you need to take a different approach. And OCD Midwest is all about helping people normalize that approach and help people find resources to finding that approach. And it's a tough road, but you know, but it can definitely, I mean, Jon and I have done it. Joanna helps people do it, and it's so that was important to know that. I guess you know, the statistics are somewhat staggering. You know, when you read about them, that, you know, 1 in 100 people have OCD that are adults, and that's pretty significant, I think. And also, I think another thing that I wish I knew then that I know now is don't delay getting into therapy. Don't think you can work your way around therapy.
Yeah, there's a stigma associated with therapy, and it's good to just get that out of the way and just get started, because it's with OCD you want to avoid everything, and to treat OCD you need to confront all those scary thoughts and feelings. So it's always it's paramount to get into therapy.
Well, and how do you find the right therapy? I think is also it can be a really daunting thing for people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was lucky enough to, when I came out of inpatient and found a support group that was only half a mile away from my house, and with that support group I found my therapist. So like just, you know, just by having that, like, the facilitator told me about this therapist that specialized in ERP and OCD and ACT and all these different tools. Like, it really aligned to it. It was awesome to have those. It's always interesting when people are like, it took me 10-15 years to find someone. I'm very grateful for that. It was kind of,
Well, and you just threw out so many acronyms, and in case people
define them.
don't know what those acronyms are, in case, because since we're talking about people who might be new to this, ERP is exposure and response prevention, and ACT is acceptance and commitment therapy. Did you throw out any more acronyms?
I don't think so.
Were those the only two that you
OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder.
OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. So if you're looking, so I just want to put in a plug out there that if you're looking for therapy, make sure that you're looking for ERP or ACT or something that there's evidence behind the therapy. So you're actually likely to get better.
Yeah, that looks like Mike's gonna talk.
Yeah, Mike, what were you gonna say?
I was just going to say that, yeah, that really is so important, and that finding the right therapy, and the right thaerappy is out there. I don't want to make it sound like you can't find it, because you can find it. I mean, thankfully there's more and more providers that are learning how to practice this, on top of the many that already know how to. I know I went from talk therapist to talk therapist to talk therapist, you know, all with good intentions, you know, I think, and but all still not really scratching the surface, because I mean, they would all tell me, you know, oh, that's not going to happen. How could that happen? How could what you're worried about actually happen? You know, and like with OCD, it's always going to try to find a way to convince you that what you're worried about could actually happen. And so I knew about ERP for probably about 12 years before I actually did it. And the reason I intentionally waited so long is because I knew what it was and I never wanted to do it. until I got to an absolute crisis point where basically it was, I have tried everything else. My life is an absolute mess. I'm dysfunctional at age 35, and I don't care if I like it. I have to do this.
Yeah, I was gonna say for sure on that, because like for me, when I was diagnosed, or it was basically, my dad died. I had multiple other things happen. I went from being a stay-at-home dad to not being able to touch my kid, change his diaper, all these things, like all these contamination things. And like I found myself over Christmas Eve of 2017 in the psych ward. And just like once I came out of there, it was, a crash course on like finding resources and locating like information, because it was, there's there's a lot of information out there about OCD, but it's uncovering that information. And we're fortunate in Ohio to have pretty good footprint for OCD stuff, but I mean, there's still areas of Ohio that aren't. I don't know what it feels like to be someone in like Southeast Ohio or some rural part of another part of Midwest, or OCD Midwest. But I'll go ahead, Joanna.
Well, I'm just wondering, I think you guys bring up a good point. So if there's someone out there who is thinking about starting ERP and they're terrified of doing exposures or terrified of facing something that they haven't faced, what could you tell them that you wish you knew then that you know now about the process or about any part of it? Is there anything that you guys can think of having gone through it?
For me, it was learning what my values were and aligning like why am I going through this therapy? Like, what do I want to gain back in life? Like, I want to go do this with my son, or I want just independence of going out of my house or sitting in this spot that is bugging me, or whatever the case may be. Like, just getting that, identifying the values, and then however I could attain those, have those values aligned with whatever course of action. And like the amount of times that I've done so many weird exposures, and like in public bathrooms and just all these things, and it's just like it's kind of weird when you put your mind to things that you can do. And a lot of it boils down for like life is about the ands, and like something can be hard and I have to do this to better myself and reduce the OCD burden on me.
That's great. I love that. I love that. So linking it to your why, what your values are, that life can be hard and you can do it. Mike, anything before we move on to our next question?
Well, thanks. Thank you, Joanna and John. Thank you for all that, all those amazing answers, John, about, your reasons why. And my answer is not a whole lot different than John's. I mean, different reasons, but same process. I think I went through mine in stages. As therapy progressed, I had to keep, asking myself harder and harder questions. And so I think Joanna's original question was, what would encourage people to get into treatment sooner, knowing that they would have to face fears and be uncomfortable. And I would ask them, I would say, where are you at now? And where, if you could imagine it, where would you like to be someday? And those were some of the questions that I asked myself. And I mean, I knew where I was at now. I knew, I had been running from this thing that had been chasing me through, at the time, 22 years of my life. And I knew really no different other than I had to run away. I had to avoid things. I had to do things other people didn't need to do. They didn't need to do them, but I needed to do them. And And so I finally got to a point where I was like, I knew that facing that, the disorder would be probably the hardest thing I'd ever done ever. But I just said, I mean, I've got to give it a solid try. I just have to give it, and I did. And then I asked myself questions on top of that, things like, you know, uh, why am I so different than other people? Why does that person not have to check the door when they leave, but I have to? So there was a lot of kind of determination that built through those kind of question and answers, and it just kind of snowballed when I kept asking myself. And that's the thing I would say about asking yourself questions is you have to be able to demand honest answers from yourself. You can't tell yourself, you have to hold yourself accountable, I think is what it is.
I love that.
I would also, I wanted to read this quote because another thing that is important is like learning what recovery from OCD looks like, because it's not like you're ever just cured. Like this is a battle for, remainder of life. It's just how you engage in that battle. But this quote comes from John Hirschfield, and it says, "So in the end, the cure for OCD is to understand that there is no such thing as a cure for OCD. There is nothing to be cured. There are thoughts, feelings, and sensations, and by being a student of them instead of a victim of them, you can change your relationship to them and live a joyful, mostly unimpaired life. When you do this, you get dumped by the DSM, which is another acronym for Joanna. The book can call me cured, but if I want to stay cured, in the book's eyes, I must categorically call myself something else. Perhaps I can just identify myself on being somewhere along the path to the mastery of my mind. That is my mind, the one with OCD." That's from John Hirschfield.
I love that. Love that.
I think there's one other thing I was going to add to that question. That's a great quote, John. John Hirschfield, if anybody hasn't looked at his books, he's an amazing author and a therapist. But one other thing I would say is that this isn't a tryout for another life. This is the only one we have.
Beautifully put.
Do we want to? I'll field the next question to Joanna.
I don't know. You want to field one to me, or I
Sure.
can certainly field one to you guys.
Nah, you can take this one. We've already touched on it somewhat, but given what we know now, where can someone with that thinks they have OCD go for help for this condition?
Well, I think like John, who mentioned it? John or Mike, one of you guys mentioned, I think a great place to start is the IOCDF. They have a therapist directory, depending on where people are that are listening to this or watching this, because there at least you'll be able to get a sense about people in your specific area that are trained to treat OCD. I think that's a much better place to start than going to something broad like Psych Today. So I think going to the IOCDF is good. I think that's where I would recommend people start, is IOCDF. I don't know if you guys would say something different. I find like most people's general doctors or psychiatrists don't always know who really knows how to treat OCD. Do you guys have any different ideas?
One thing that I did along with when I was first diagnosed was I wanted to learn everything and anything about OCD. Like I would be in support groups. Like support groups,
great point.
For like there's multiple support groups. There's one in Columbus. There's one. Mike runs one. There's one in Akron, Canton area. But yeah, there's online support groups too. But like we would exchange information, all this stuff like, oh, you should read this book or you should read this or read that. And I got to the point where I got so annoyed, I guess, that I created a resource packet with like books, podcasts, like all these things, because like when you're first diagnosed, it can be very obviously overwhelming. So I want, my main focus when I first was diagnosed was helping myself, but then also like how the next person doesn't suffer like as much as, like, lucky I was able to find other things, but it's still like the day-to-day battles, like, so just locating those resources and there's so many resources out there. It's just finding them, but I will be linking my OCD starter kit onto social media here shortly. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. Because you're right. There's a lot out there, but it's hard to know what's good versus what's not good. So that's really helpful. Mike, you have anything to add?
I was just going to echo what both of you had already said and say that there is a plethora of resources out there, and I will say about the OCD community is that it never ceases to amaze me just how uplifting and supportive they are as a community of individuals. And thankfully, with the emergence of social media, since I mean, there's even more closed support groups that are available. I agree with what Joanna said too about being able to sift through the unhelpful methods of therapy, and try to find therapy that's because I think that was a big realization for me. Kind of went back to what I said a second ago, was that I was looking for the comfortable way for so many years. There's got to be a more comfortable way. If I just get the right answers or whatever, and you don't want a therapy that's going to, has been my experiences, you don't want a therapy that's going to instantaneously make you comfortable, or try to make you comfortable. ERP doesn't work like that, but it doesn't. I feel like we always want to get to the next step. If I just felt comfortable, then I could do this. But ERP is outside of kind of all of that. It's been my experience. So yeah, there's been but yeah, our support network is amazing. You can go to our website for OCD Midwest, and that's going to be linked in the show notes here. And I would just look for, and the last thing I would say is I wouldn't look for one of these therapists that say that they specialize in 30 different things. Like it's very common to see that 30 different diagnoses. My therapist that I saw that got me to a better place really just specialized in OCD and anxiety.
If I can go, oh,
if you
sorry.
think of, no, it's okay. If you think about that, like from even a medical perspective, with a doctor, is that I mean, if you go to a specialist, if you're looking for a specialist, you don't want somebody that says that they're going to specialize in 50 things, because then they're not really a specialist. They're more of a general practitioner.
If I can go on a soapbox for like 30 seconds or a rant. Well, no, not a rant, but also if they, just because they say they know CBT does not mean they know ERP, because a lot of people say that, well, I know CBT, so I'm qualified to treat OCD, but that does not mean that you're qualified to treat OCD, or even a lot of people that know CBT aren't comfortable doing exposures for something like generalized anxiety disorder. So I think it's really important to vet the therapist, make sure they're trained in ERP, make sure that they do exposure-based treatments, because old school second wave CBT is not evidence-based for OCD. I'll close my rant about that.
As I say, and if you do come across a therapist that doesn't align with ERP or CB or other methods to combat OCD, like, don't be scared to just move on, and don't just, it's your life that you're living. Like you have to someone has to advocate for themselves because, you're the only person that's, trying to get better and like.
And I will say, just on a side note, what John just said just sparked something that I am, found out the hard way, but it's very true. And is that you are your own best advocate. I really do think. I mean, there's a lot of people, plenty of people out there that are going to advocate alongside you. People in your social circle, people in the OCD community that you don't even know. They are going to be your advocate as well. If people that you disclose your diagnosis with, in confidence, they're going to, be an advocate for you. But at the end of the day, you are your strongest advocate because no one knows your experience like you.
Good point. So can I switch gears to another question?
Yeah.
Cool. Some tips or tricks for people that might be new to this. Do you guys have anything that might be helpful that you guys could share for people new to treatment?
I have way too many. Let's see.
Okay, well, not too many. You just
I'm going through them all.
bullet point some highlights.
Yeah. The things I do, keeping a list of wins and opportunities, like the smallest wins, like the smallest battles of like getting out of bed each day or showering, or just like I didn't take 4 hours to leave the house, whatever the case, whatever that thing is, like acknowledge it, celebrate it, go get an ice cream because you did it. Like it just, and incentivize yourself to embrace those wins. And then like Mike was saying, advocate for yourself. Like that goes a long way. Another thing, OCD and any mental illness can be debilitating, and learning, and you just want to beat yourself up, and learning about self-compassion, like actual practicing self-compassion, like goes a long way. It's something I was struggling with because I was like, I'm just gonna beat myself up until I'm happy, and then it just doesn't work. And then learning different practices, like practicing mindfulness and just kind of staying in the moment, realizing when you need to get, when you're overwhelmed, and just remove yourself from situations and just walk outside, hear the birds, hear whatever, take a break. Don't worry about having boundaries and, excusing yourself, because it is what it is. Like you are dealing with what you're dealing with, and that's okay.
I love those. Mike?
I think, I mean, I've got, like John, I've got several as well. That could be a whole different webinar in itself, with John and I discussing probably tips and tricks, and Joanna discussing tips and tricks. But if there was one trick I would say that I use that's helped me probably the most, is you have to make exposure and response prevention a lifestyle. It has to be something that's done constantly.
One
That
other
was
thing
going to be mine too. That was going to be what I suggested, Mike.
what I want to say, one other thing that and it was the support group topic of this last week, but it was basically like make sure you're separating yourself from your OCD. Like you aren't your OCD. Like you have control over it. Like not control, but it gives you the power back to say, I hear you, I acknowledge that you exist, and I'm going to do this. Like, and it sounds impossible when you're first starting out, but you will get there, I promise, if you practice and just, and it's not every day you're going to win. You're going to have battles that you lose, but it's just getting back on the horse and trying again.
Yeah. One of my clients had the greatest line. She said that she was able to find the stand in the gap, that tiny space in her, when she found recovery, the stand in the gap between her thought and what she wanted to do. And that's what recovery meant to her. And I thought that is just, I love that so much. Because there is that gap. You don't feel like there is in the beginning, like that tiny space you feel like doesn't exist. But it does. It might be super tiny. And I have to echo what Mike said, because I feel like I've been a therapist for 26 years, and I feel like something that differentiates people that get better, and sometimes people that can stall out, people who look for opportunities to get better. And they look for every opportunity, or a lot of opportunities, to practice outside of just like the one thing they said they were going to do. I think that's incredibly helpful, because it is a lifestyle.
Yeah, there's the situational exposures, and that's something that I tried to do early on, was learn as much as I possibly could about the process, and that was one thing that was mentioned a few different times that I've tried to practice and still practice, is don't wait for the experiences to come to you that you have to do exposures, or you find yourself needing to do an exposure. If you can voluntarily seek that out, that's gonna, I think, prove to be more beneficial. It's almost like an attitude change. It's almost like, I'm not gonna wait for you to come to me to bother me. I'm gonna go bother you.
Yeah, it's going on offense. I think there's an OCD Stories podcast with Jon Bommarito about this too. Living the CBT lifestyle, I think, that was really good about it.
Yeah, special plug for the OCD Stories. If you
Yeah.
started out, there's so many lived experiences, therapists, all, it's the full gambit of people.
Yeah, talk about like where to find help. That's an incredible resource.
Excellent. Do we want to touch base on, it's like a 10,000 foot question, but for Joanna, like, when someone asks you, like, where does this come from, or how do people develop this? Do you have any go-to answers that you?
I mean, we don't really know. I mean, it's like, what I tell people is that it's biological, it's learned, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is where we go from here.
Awesome.
I don't know if you guys would add anything.
Well, I can just echo what I saw I just watched, and speaking again about the IOCDF, and if anybody is not, if they haven't subscribed on YouTube to the IOCDF YouTube page, there's constant live streams. They do a tremendous job of constantly putting out information, be it from a lived experience, from a clinical perspective, from a research perspective, anything like that. And I just watched a webinar that they had just put out it was on their research roundtable called From Genes to Brains to OCD, and they had about 5 panelists on that. And it was about an hour discussion to say that they have some idea on what's going on, but they're still, they're further along than they were, but they still don't really know. And Joanna's right. It's at the end of the day, it's like, time is ticking away, and it's your life, and you have to make a decision.
Mm-hmm. Those research roundtables are really good. Good plug for it. Other questions that we have, did we get to all of them? I'm looking at, do you guys want to give a plug for your support groups, or are we going to link it at the end?
We can link it at the end, but
okay.
We in Columbus area, we actually, in Ohio, we have hybrid, so we meet once. I think we're doing once every 3 months now, but in person, but then also online. Meet twice a month. It's based out of Columbus, but it's brought to you by Mental Health America of Ohio, and it's facilitated by Beth McCreary, who's a licensed therapist. Great work. And yeah, Mike.
Oh, I've met Dr. McCreary also as well, and she's an amazing professional as well. One last thing I wanted to say was, did we also want to just briefly, Joanna, if you wanted to take it, and this is more of a generalized question, I think, is does somebody with OCD necessarily have to take medication? in
Oh.
your experience?
Sure. That's a really common question when people are starting out. And again, I always defer people to talk to their psychiatrist if they have one about that, or, their physician. But, no one has to do anything. I mean, so it's completely up to the person, that medication question. Sometimes it makes treatment easier, but certainly that's a great question and a great conversation to have with their prescriber. So I've seen people do it any number of ways, but it's certainly a really common question and one to dive deeper in with their prescriber.
Yeah, for me, from my aspect, like everyone always seems to go to their general practitioner for like psych meds. I don't know, and it was kind of awesome to have an experience of actually meeting with a psychiatrist to actually like go through, actually properly get prescribed. And one thing for me, like I do take medication, and it's probably the third medication I'm on now, because there are side effects or whatever the case may be. But like, don't be afraid to change meds or increase or decrease meds. It's definitely a balancing act. And then also, don't stop if you are on meds. Don't stop them just because you feel good, because there's a reason why you are starting to normalize and stabilize. So
one thing I would say too is don't expect a general psychiatrist to know all the ins and outs of OCD medication. I really had to work with mine for a while based on the literature and all the things that the OCD experts were saying as far as dosages and everything like that goes. They might not be a general psychiatrist they kind of handle an array of different things. I mean, and so just do your research and don't be afraid to bring in, documented, official literature about OCD to your doctor.
yeah.
And there is something on the IOCDF website about medication. I think there's a page, at least a page.
And it comes back to advocating for yourself.
Yep. Great. That's a really important. Well, thank you guys. I think we covered everything.
Thank you for being here for our very first webinar for OCD Awareness Week. Please keep an eye on the channel for more content that's going to be coming out soon. And please go to the OCD Midwest website.